thank you. Thanks for your hospitality and convincing me to make this journey to a town that, of all the cities I visited, this is my first stop here, and I'm really enjoying the last couple of days. To the Dean, thank you for having this event here at the law school, and to the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, thank you again for inviting me. Okay. So today, I'm probably going to provocatively leave you with more questions than answers. But clearly that's my intent in this conversation today. So here's what I want to do to get started. We're going to do something that we generally don't do on a daily basis, but we're going to do time travel. So all of us, position yourself and propel yourself into the future now. And we're going to fasten our seatbelts and arrive one day after the U.S. elections in November of 2020. Or should I say the re-election. Donald Trump is re-elected President of the United States. Yeah, he lost by 5 million votes, but again won that electoral college. People across the United States are stunned. Can't believe it. Many Democrats thought they had this one. They're depressed and yet angry at the exact same time. After a couple of dozen Democratic candidates for president, Democrats are kind of lost, looking for maybe a new path. We are a country divided. We were divided going into this election, and now the stresses of the division will be exacerbated. At home, calls for impeachment rise once again. And this time the Speaker is on board, but the likelihood of the Senate convicting him is still quite small. Institutions in the U.S. government are under stress. They've been under stress, but they're now crumbling. As people who contemplated leaving in 2019 and 20 throughout the government stayed on, anticipating the government would have changed. Whatever damage you thought was done in that first term, well, now the path is becoming more permanent. Thousands of U.S. government employees now preparing resignation letters. Many positions, like in the previous 4 years, will remain unfilled. And those that are occupied will be occupied by Trump loyalists. With defunding of government agencies, the functioning of many normal services will be delayed. To some, it may even mirror the Eastern Bloc pre-Berlin Wall type of democracy, bureaucracy. Capitals around the world, with only a few exceptions, are in shock once again. The first Trump victory was deemed an aberration. But now with the Trump re-election, it's clear America is and will continue to be a very different place. Several departments of the U.S. government will be effectively closed. One department that stands out most notably is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. After the previous year of dismantling environmental regulations from prior administrations, the Trump White House has turned over to corporations for corporate self-policing in the spirit of regulation reduction. By the way, the White House also promises to continue to take funds from closed agencies and departments to fund that wall down at the Mexico border. You know, the president had promised that Mexicans would pay for it. So this first new day, he decides once again to put tariffs on Mexico to help pay for that wall, kind of as a post-election fundraiser. On the world stage, any hope of America's reversion to the global protector of liberal democracy, small l, small d, is dashed. No longer a strong guiding force for good, offsetting the extreme, America has become the extreme in an inward-focused, xenophobic, unilateralist nation, and will continue along that path, unfortunately, for this foreseeable future. The fallout. Let's talk about that. So much of his second term, foreign policy, will be focused on President Trump's lifelong beliefs. You know, those beliefs that every country in the world has and continues to take advantage of the USA. Well, we're not going to take it anymore, says Donald Trump. And so specifically, he begins to go back on his long-expressed concerns that trade is stacked against the USA and promises extensive new tariffs on the basis of national security. Oh, he also declares NATO, any nation not immediately meeting the 2% spending of GDP on defense will either be kicked out of the alliance or we're going to slap some new tariffs on them so that they can pay for it. Simultaneously, the master deal maker maybe even proposed Russia join NATO, especially after he successfully invited them back to the G7 at his G7 meeting at his Doral resort. Oil drilling will soon begin off the coast of Alaska and the Arctic. And the president proposes perhaps even additional drilling as a result of Mideast continued tensions, maybe even in the Great Lakes, where he believes, with no scientific evidence whatsoever, that large amounts of oil exist. Why should I even begin and have this conversation in this way? Why should we think this way? Looking into the future is really hard. Just forecasting the weather has its limitations, but predicting political winds are even that much more challenging. Yes, in some ways, this is completely hypothetical. In some ways, it's extreme. But in other ways, it's entirely possible. We can just imagine the ways a Trump re-election would impact climate, the environment, commerce, energy, military, intelligence, homeland security, international affairs, and the list can go on and on and on. But here's the reality. Most presidents running for re-election for the last 100 years have won. Those that aren't re-elected have been due to weak economies, and I'm not rooting for that. So all things being equal, which they never really are, but all things being equal, a Trump's re-election is a distinct possibility. What does that mean for our international relations, and more specifically, Canada? Well, we don't know exactly. But like fire drills in an office tower, we don't believe a fire's coming. But if it does, I sure want to know what the plans are and where the exit is. Today, here in Canada, a federal election is underway. And a lot of things are appropriately being discussed. And of course, most of it's on domestic issues. Internationally, the ever-important relationship with the U.S., while not the smooth functionality of the Trudeau-Obama era, I think things are generally in better shape than they've been in over these last few years during the Trump government. After navigating a renegotiated NAFTA and disposing of the inappropriate steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, the Canada-U.S. relationship is generally working well. Clearly, the issues with China and how Canada has found itself caught in between these two superpowers continue to persist. But overall, given the range of possibilities, the relationship is in about as good a position as one could hope for, especially relative to relationships the U.S. has with other nations around the world right now. But in the event Donald Trump is re-elected, that balance will be tested. So knowing this possibility, what types of things can Canada do to prepare itself? The reality, as I said at the beginning, there may be more questions than answers. But I thought a realistic assessment of some of the many questions Canada may face would be a constructive way to have this conversation today. When I became ambassador, I set out in a speech in the National Gallery in Ottawa with a broad set of objectives in my tenure, covering various subjects: trade, energy and the environment, cultural diplomacy, international affairs, and of course, the functioning of our shared border. So let's talk trade for a minute. NAFTA, a revised NAFTA. That deal's not done yet. It may not get passed if the administration doesn't adequately address the problems that exist in this agreement. So if it doesn't get passed, what is the path ahead? The range of possibilities is wide, but the most challenging path is that the U.S. withdraws from the existing NAFTA. I know people say, he can't do that, or not to worry, we'll fall back on some previous trade agreement that we have, or the WTO. But I think if the president does that, the uncertainty that he will create will indeed hurt the Canadian economy. In addition, global tariffs are generally a bad course, and the impact is affecting decision-making by businesses all around the globe. Self-proclaimed tariff man, who said trade wars are easy to win, may indeed dial up trade wars and tariffs in the second term. Canadian businesses should game out these scenarios now and build in contingencies for both raising tariffs on non-Canadian goods, but also potentially as well as new tariffs on Canadian goods, or products like uranium, which was already debated on the basis of national security just a few months ago. Finally, I think Canada has this really unique opportunity to go on offense. You see, Canada has several very large international trade agreements already in place. CETA with Europe, CPTPP, trade with Asia. Canada may be better positioned on international trade given Trump's behaviors on trade and tariffs than the U.S. I think Canada should also continue to expand talented immigration and expand skill sets, especially as the U.S. is closing its door. You should keep your immigration open in your own way, But we're in a battle of old economy versus new economy. And in fact, the old economy jobs continue to be threatened. They've been initially threatened by low wages in low-wage countries and moving jobs overseas, but now automation is replacing jobs at an incredibly fast rate. Canada needs to stay focused on the new economy, and if it does, it could find itself very well positioned for this next economic landscape. Let's talk energy and the environment. They go hand in hand, energy and the environment. We have to take into account the carbon impact and the environment and bring it together. But now we're on a new and dangerous path that will only get worse as the administration continues to reduce or eliminate pollution standards in the United States. So in a world where countries, virtually all the scientists and millions of people recognize climate change is real, the U.S. federal standards are continuing to get weakened and continue potentially to put Canada in a very uncomfortable position. Just look at the legal battle right now underway between the U.S. government and the state of California and the auto industry on mileage and pollution standards. Canada will be further challenged between the two worlds of carbon-based and clean economies, both at home and abroad. Geopolitically, liberal democratic order of this post-World War II, Canada has been a middle power and has always relied on being there with your big brother, or might I say big sister, USA, at your side. But a self-focused, xenophobic, isolationist president has left Canada to fend for itself. A perfect example of that is the retaliation and stress with Saudi Arabia, leaving Canada alone fending for women's rights and suffering the consequences. You also see it with China and the recognition for implementing illegal extradition. The question you will have going forward will be how to handle future requests from the USA. What if those challenges and those requests from the USA challenge your values, but line your pocketbook? How will you confront social injustice when the cost of doing so continues to rise? For me, today, while the UN General Assembly is all together, a Canadian seat on the UN Security Council is more important than ever. See, the world's losing its defenders of liberal democratic order of things. And I believe this increases the importance of having Canada's seat on the Security Council. But it probably makes it harder, as President Trump may be more transactional in supporting who gets this seat. Canada, are you willing to transact? And there's NATO. The second term, as I mentioned, Trump will probably force countries to make sure they spend at that 2% level or out, or adding Russia. But look, we have NORAD, which protects North America. We have the Five Eyes, the intelligence community, and other areas of cooperation. Will these be dismantled? Are these going to be jeopardized? Or a breakdown, a result of the behavior of the United States, just as the world moves ahead without the USA in the Paris Accord or TPP? Will the world move ahead in these other areas? Will Five Eyes become Four Eyes without the United States because of the lack of trust of the intelligence community, of the president? Culture. Let's talk culture for a minute. Free speech will be under attack as fake media could move to fake everything, especially if Trump doesn't like the narrative. It's just fake. So for me, I think of the artist and the voice of the artist through their work. That may be threatened. Movement of art and artists and media under threat at the U.S. borders. You see, today, we're even seeing it today. Reporters being rejected from Canada to come to the U.S. Art being turned away because they think it is inappropriate because some border official is rejecting it. But tomorrow's border policies can get even worse. So when I arrived in Canada, people talked to me about the Canadian-U.S. border in this term: thick versus thin. If Donald Trump's reelected, one has to assume they may thicken substantially. What happens if individuals are further micro-targeted at the border because of race, because of religion, because of background? What happens if the U.S. federal government does a crackdown on something? Maybe it's marijuana use. What happens if enhanced inspections are instituted? Heightened immigration fears in the USA will cause people of diverse backgrounds not to be admitted to the United States, just because border officials may fear if they come for holidays they may not leave, so just not let them in. But I think there's another thing that Canada needs to focus on, and the real impact may be increased migration northbound. Plan for it. Prepare for it. The American refugee. In light of news of what might happen if Donald Trump makes a threat to Canada for personal or political gain at the expense or the benefit of the country, what will Canada do? We just have seen this with Ukraine in these issues. How should you handle this as a country? What happens if Donald Trump's international policies continue to impact Canada adversely, a la China, Other sorts of retaliation or additional Chinese retaliation is directed toward Canadians. Many questions, not easy answers. But Canadians need to prepare because this is a distinct possibility that this could happen. Let's talk the economy. The path of things under Donald Trump and the huge opportunity for Canada, I think, lies ahead. See, back about 100 years ago, or a little more than 100 years ago, the world moved from agrarian to industrial. We experienced rising wages, rising productivity, workers got new jobs. Next came corporate movement of jobs to lower cost labor markets. So it started then farming jobs out to the detriment of both Canada and the U.S. Those were the early days of the stress of NAFTA, which unfortunately is being portrayed in that way today as he says, the worst agreement of all time. But there still exists a world today where increasingly automated job replacement is taking place. But it is a world where highly skilled workers are increasingly in demand. So my recommendation to Canada in that world, continue to focus on R&D, continue to focus on immigration, continue to focus on entrepreneurial activities, focus on education. In this new world, Canada should lean in aggressively. Again, I want to reiterate, position yourself for the new economy. It's here, it's happening, and it's happening fast. Relationships, we all have them. Friends, family, partners. Relationships are based on trust. That's the same between whether it's companies or countries. Even when there are disagreements, we have a set of rules of engagement, a set of standards, laws. We're all learning laws. But what happens when one party doesn't respect the standards of interaction, nor believes the laws pertain to them? Or to further complicate matters, what happens when one party plays by their own set of rules, but yet expects you to respect the law? You have a breakdown in that trust. This has happened between the Trump administration and institutions and organizations at home and abroad. In a second term, relationships will be further tested. In Canada, this relationship will be tested as well. You'll need to navigate very carefully and very creatively in a world like that. How you do this, I think, may be one of your biggest challenges. So, this discussion today is meant to be a first step, a reality check. Do I think Donald Trump's getting reelected? Well, I didn't think he'd win in the first place. So I'm making no assumptions here. I'm saying anything is possible. The lecture is a message to you. Don't be complacent. Prepare for a next Trump administration and the world it might create. Back in the embassy, I had a senior officer who worked with me at the embassy. And when I first arrived, I came in and I said, so tell me about the challenges between the U.S. and Canada. She looked at me and said, sir, there are no challenges. There are only opportunities. So as difficult as we, the United States, make it for you, Canada, especially if Donald Trump is elected, you will have boundless opportunities if you're willing to grab them. Thank you. Open to questions. Exactly. Anything you want to talk about? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Christopher, my question is about the American economy. If the U.S. economy slips into recession or another economic crisis, how do you think the Trump administration would react and how would it impact Canada?
Okay, so for those of you in here, let's talk about potential recession in the United States, and then how will that impact the U.S., Canada, and what do you think Trump will do? So let's break it down a couple of ways. First of all, recessions happen. It's not if, we're going to have a recession. It's just a matter of when. It's part of natural cycle of things. This cycle is particularly extended, and it's longer than most. And part of that is the base in which we started. We started at such a low base after the 2008 and 9 economic crisis that took place. So the first question that might be applicable here is that recession coming between now and Election Day, or is that recession coming after Election Day? And I will say the following. I'm concerned about the next recession. I always get concerned about recessions because it impacts people and it's hard and stock markets decline, etc. But in the U.S., let me just give you a few statistics that you can think about, which give me unease as to how tenuous the economy is right now in the States. First of all, stock markets rallied huge. Unemployment's near a 50-year low, so we've got all that good news at the headline level. But below the headlines, the gap between rich and poor and the focus of where that wealth has been created in the top 10%, maybe in some cases really the top 1% of the people of our country have gotten that wealth. The bottom end of the spectrum have not really increased their wealth at all throughout this last cycle. In fact, the Federal Reserve has said that something more than 40% of Americans have less than $400 reserve. $400, 40%. Almost half the country has less than $400. Recent surveys say that 78%, up from like low 70s, live paycheck to paycheck. So just getting one paycheck, spending the money, getting the next paycheck. And picture this, just happened at the beginning of this year, when the federal government, the U.S. government, shut down as a result of a dispute between Congress and the White House. In 2 weeks' time, U.S. government employees were on food lines. So it's a real stressful point where once we experience layoffs, which happen in recessions, that things could really get very, very difficult very quickly in the States. The second thing is that private equity has blown way out of proportion in terms of valuations. And I think there's a lot of services that have been provided throughout the States, even up here, through things like Uber and Lyft and delivery of food and goods and WeWork space, all of that. All of those things have been done at loss. You're buying all those services at below cost. And these companies have been able to exist because they've been able to fundraise both in private equity or debt markets or equity markets, but they keep operating at losses. I think in a recession, those companies are going to be under stress. So they're either going to have to raise price or go out of business because you can't keep operating at a loss, especially if you lose your sustenance, the capital that's coming in. So the Federal Reserve has very little room to keep lowering rates. Rates are really low. The Congress has very little room to spend a whole lot more money because we're running huge budget deficits. So the cushion is not there. Like a squirrel saving nuts for winter, we're actually eating all of the nuts, and enjoying ourselves here. And when winter comes, it's going to be a lot more challenging. And the world is slowing down quite a bit right now because of these tariffs that businesses can't make economic decisions. So we're seeing numbers in Germany, throughout Europe, Japan, Asia, China, everything's slowing down. What's keeping the U.S. the prop is the U.S. consumer. We spend a lot of money. 70% of the economy is consumer-based. And so it's still being propelled, and lowering interest rates are doing it. The president is screaming for a couple of things. He's screaming at the head of the Fed to lower rates a lot. Like, keep lowering, because he sees the slowing happening. So he's trying to get interest rates even lower. The second thing is he's throwing out ideas of cutting taxes again. Even though we're kind of like tax cut out, he's trying to find ways to stimulate things. He may actually come up with an idea for big expenditures, government expenditures next year, But I don't know if Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are going to go along with all that. And big infrastructure projects take a long time to go. You can't just like wake up, let's spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, and you know, it takes a long time to build roads, bridge. You gotta get permits, you gotta do analysis. So we're gonna have a recession. I'm worried it's gonna be really difficult. The tools in our toolbox are diminished, not completely gone. And and you guys sell 70 plus, close to 75% of your exports go to one country. And that country is the United States, so you feed into it. Some large portion oil and gas, some large portion autos and other things. And so you'll be impacted by it. And you should prepare for it as well. Because as the U.S. will go, I think the Canadian economy will, you know, you can't avoid it. You're just too linked together as two economies going together. And so historically, I would say Canada has not gone down or up as much as the U.S. economy. Like if the U.S. did this, Canada's always like this. I think personality-wise, it's like that too. And so I would say though, I think you need to really work hard on, you know, save some money, be prepared, understand what, you know, the path that may lie ahead. Sorry for a long answer, but it's something that I am personally concerned about. Hi.
Hi, Paul Manson.
How are you?
Well, thank you.
Good.
You mentioned drilling for oil off Alaska and in the Great Lakes, and probably not as tongue-in-cheek as you might have thought it would, but I'm wondering what you think the President's endgame is with respect to energy movement between Canada and the United States. We're having our own problems with pipelines, as you know, but it seems that he blows hot and cold in terms of whether or not the pipelines are going to come across or not.
Figuring out how Donald Trump behaves or believes any given day is a really challenging thing. But I think in general, his number one goal is, you know, and if you listened, I listened to some of his speech today at the UN, he is all about USA, 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 USA. He doesn't think multilateral, he doesn't think bilateral, he doesn't think, everything is a byproduct of what's just driving home. And so really happy he's fracking and drilling and going and looking everywhere for energy. That all being said, I believe the energy component for the United States is deeply dependent upon our imports from Canada, energy from all sources. And I think that the recent military activity that took place, the attack on Saudi Arabia that took place, demonstrates the security of our energy as a result of our relationship with Canada. And I think that I'm appreciative of that. I gotta believe that the people around him, especially the large money donors to his campaign, which are very energy based, in at least some segment of it is, that they're going to be proponents of the U.S.-Canada energy relationship and continuing to grow. The challenge then is the people on the ground, and you face this here in this country with regard to pipelines. I mean, we have dozens of pipelines between Canada and the U.S. It's just the new incremental pipeline when you call somebody and say, "This, you know, do you believe in it?" In some parts of the country goes, "Sure, I believe in it. Great, it's going through your yard." "No, I don't believe in it that much." And so it's this NIMBY, not in my backyard, exists, you know, everywhere. I think people in concept are much more favorable for different things as long as it doesn't directly impact them, of all time. So where are we? We're highly dependent on Canada for energy. We continue to consume it. I think, though, the path ahead for fossil fuels is, regardless of whatever the Trump administration is doing, is declining, and will continue to decline over time as alternative energy sources become cheaper and cheaper. And I think you've got to prepare for that. But there's a short-term, medium-term, and long-term game for energy. The short-term game is this is still, you know, we're still using it. I still took a plane here, took a car here, still use fossil fuels, and I don't see that changing anytime really soon. So short and medium term. The problem with a pipeline or some of these other big infrastructure projects are that they hope to get paid back over like 30, 40, 50 years. Well, I think in the fossil fuel business, you can see how 5 and 10. Beyond 10, it gets more challenging. And so, you know, that's the issue of where we're going to allocate capital to build these new. And I think that may be a bigger part of the equation than the permissions that will be granted to put these pipelines in. These are expensive. And who's going to allocate their capital to do this if they think it's going to go away and the product's not going to be there anymore? It's kind of, you know, it's kind of like if I went around a few years ago and said, I got this great idea, we're going to put in more Blockbuster locations all over. And we've used videotapes for a long time, isn't this a good idea? And you're like, well, I don't think so, this new technology may be putting you out. And so, you know, it may very well be that the oil and gas industry is the Blockbuster equivalent of, but I don't know the timeline. If I knew the timeline, I'd give you a better answer.
Hi, my name is Darinka. I listened, I think, carefully to your presentation and appreciate it very much. I particularly like the topic of NAFTA agreement that you mentioned a couple of times, as well as the CBT. But I think that you have not mentioned CETA agreement, which is Canada-European Union trade agreement, which came into force in 2017. And I would really appreciate if you can maybe give a little bit of those kind of political position of the U.S. towards that Canada-European trade agreement. Because I don't think I have read much about it.
So the president thinks in really bilateral terms. He has a really hard time, and he finally would be able to get to this new NAFTA on a trilateral terms. But he's really having challenges on a multilateral basis. He just doesn't operate that way. He just either he thinks we're getting taken advantage of or doesn't. So remember, he got out of Paris, he got out of TPP. Really the Iran deal was a multilateral deal, although it was Iran, but a lot of European countries and the U.S. were all involved in this. He needs to, and he's talking now, I'm going to do China alone, I'm going to do Japan alone, I'm going to do each of these deals, one-off deals, and doesn't think about the collective. That's harder when Europe operates as a collective. And so his answer, instead of saying, which he talked about today, he said, Britain leaves, we'll do a deal with Britain. Hello, you got all the rest of Europe sitting there. What about that? Like, why don't we talk about doing a deal with Europe? He can't do it. I just don't think they operate that way. And I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think that's the competitive advantage that Canada now has. That you now have these two deals. You basically have the world map now of where you can do trade. So a company that comes to Canada can actually export to the entire world. Especially if NAFTA's done. I mean, you're going to have most of the economy of the world all under. You got Europe, you got Asia, you got this. I mean, let's go. And I would take advantage of that. As a country, I would continue to lean in, knowing, of course, that the U.S. is not entering TPP, says the president. The U.S. will not do CETA. The U.S. is going to be left out of most of these big deals. And again, I think it's a competitive advantage Canada has on the U.S. now. And if there's a Trump re-election, I point out that that's a big opportunity for the country. Hi.
Thanks, Randy. Just wondering, in your own opinion, do you think that the private sector development agreement that he just recently made with Brazil was in good faith? That this is going to be a good agreement with the Amazon? And there's going to...
Who, he, Donald Trump? Or he, who?
The U.S., yeah, the U.S.,
Okay.
Mike?
Pompeo.
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry. And the other, and Brazil's foreign minister last Friday
Yeah.
made a private sector.
I'm not deeply steeped in that specific agreement, but I will tell you that I worry about the word trust and reliability that what good is an agreement if you enter into an agreement and you don't trust the party to abide by the laws of the agreements that you work on? And I think that the biggest indication of concern for me was when we had just signed this North American New Deal. And it was just signed. And then the president says, I'm going to put tariffs on Mexico on the basis of now immigration. And what he's done is he's weaponized now economic tariffs that were used only for economic outcomes historically. He's now weaponized those. And so then the answer is, how do I rely and trust you? Interesting thing that's happening, just as a side note, you've got Japan where he is saying that I'm working on a trade deal. He, Donald Trump, is saying I'm working on a trade deal with Japan. And the word out over the last couple of days is Japan is saying, okay, we can do this interim deal, but I want to guarantee you're not going to tax my autos. And I think it's an impediment for the guys in the West. Well, wait a minute, I want to be able to tax your autos. Well, that's the great thing that your sitting prime minister actually got accomplished. He slipped in that letter that basically said Canadian autos would not be tariffed. And he had it as part of the deal that was signed. It went into effect immediately. Even if the trade deal doesn't pass in the U.S., he's got this deal with Donald Trump that the Canadian autos aren't going to be tariffs. And so I think the Japanese are going, I want one of those, right? I want one of those. And which is effectively putting a squeeze on the president. And so the question is, will he do the deal with Japan? If he does the deal, will he give him the auto exemption? That's his big threat tool out there. I mean, it'll be fascinating to watch. I don't trust him. He lies every day. He puts people in different positions, so I have a hard time trusting his deals. And because, you know, he hasn't demonstrated that he lives by his word. And so that's my challenge. Brazil or not. I'm sorry, you
that
go.
was my concern, was
Yeah.
this, particularly at this point with the climate change and it being such, you know, dominating the world stage at the moment, and he's making deals to invest in the Amazon. So I guess for my own personal opinion.
He doesn't
Got alarm bells on.
believe that climate change is a man-made condition.
So exactly, so to respect the Amazon,
Right.
and start exploiting land and people.
It's pretty sad what's going on there.
What I feared.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Connor Sleeper. So you mentioned the Iran deal, the attack on Saudi oil rig. So I guess now with U.S. troops going into Saudi Arabia and pulled out, and I'm wondering about, I guess, the potentiality for conflict. Is a precondition for, you know, the tensions cooling between the United States and Iran a new president? And you know, we hypothesized a Trump re-election, so I'm wondering perhaps just what your thoughts are on how the Iran-United States relationship will proceed if he's re-elected.
So the president has this perverse approach to things of, you know, it was like when we were doing healthcare, repeal and replace. It's, you know, kind of like if you need to go to work every day and drive your car, but I'm going to take your car away, but don't worry, I'm going to get you a new car sometime. And you're like, well, wait a minute, on Monday I need to get to work. He has this mentality, so he's used that mentality with abrogating agreements all around the world. So instead of going in on Paris and saying, you know, let's fix Paris so that it fits for me, and for me, the U.S., or for where we are. By the way, I think the U.S. is actually meeting the standards of Paris right now, even though he said we're getting out. But TPP, he's gotten out. Iran deal, he's getting out. And he's like, now we'll work on the replacement. So it puts the U.S. in a very difficult negotiating place and creates a lot of havoc. And so I think, had he taken the position, I don't like the deal we have with Iran currently. So I'd like to come in and sit down, and here are the things that I'd like to get corrected. Let's all work together, Europe and the Middle East, and come together. And if we don't, here are the various outcomes that will happen, and I'm going to put these in place if this doesn't happen. That's very different than, I'm out. Now let's do this. By the way, I'm slapping sanctions on you. By the way, I'm squeezing you, which is forcing them to respond. You squeeze somebody hard enough that they respond. You punch somebody, eventually they're going to punch you back. And you think that this whole Iranian move came out of the air. Like he's like, wow, boy, Iran's really acting in a bellicose way. Well, you've been squeezing them economically so hard that they're going to have to do something. Otherwise, the economy's going to fail and there's going to be anarchy domestically. I think we're playing a very dangerous game right now. Very, very dangerous. It's like a president who's flicking matches in a dry woods and, you know, is it going to catch on fire? I don't know, but it's getting more and more dangerous as the days go on. I'm for diplomatic conversations and working together and finding paths, you know. In the John F. Kennedy's book, Profile of Courage, he talks about the word compromise. Compromise is not equated to weakness, it's actually a strength. And we've got to find paths to compromise and finding paths to win-win, as opposed to he views everything in a I win, you lose mentality. So if I'm going to win, you've got to lose. And I think the world is better off in a time where the U.S. wins and the counterparty wins simultaneously, but he's not of that mindset. So I don't know where it goes. And that's the uncertainty that causes the anxiety of where we are. And especially, I think he's emboldened because we have so much oil in North America now that we're not beholden to it in the same way. Which should be another reason why we shouldn't be messing around there to begin with, but unfortunately, we are. Hi.
Hi, my name is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Can you comment on the relationship between Trump and his governance policies with the judiciary and the tension that has resulted from that?
As a result of?
Of like his policies, like separating families or the ban on certain groups?
So the judiciary is not a monolith. Like we think about it maybe in this one way, but the judiciary in and of itself is made up of individual judges and courts. When you go to a court and you ask for an opinion, especially if you think something's wrong, you bring a case against somebody. What he's been doing is very rapidly replacing judges or nominating and putting in position judges that follow his philosophy and his party's philosophy and almost to an extreme, whether it's at the Supreme Court or on down. And so the relationship should be professional but not linked, right? We should have three distinct separate branches of government that all act, independently but, work together in running the functioning of our government. But he's trying to stack the courts, which, he's working very hard at doing with his accomplices in the Senate. And so I think that there's still some courts, California district courts and so forth, that still have a more liberal bias overall, that are protecting some of these rights and doing these things. So it depends where, cases are brought. And so people kind of are very careful about where they bring various cases and how those come about. So just saying the courts have very different sets of outcomes. But if he gets a second term, you will dramatically change the footprint. We're already doing that, but you will dramatically change the footprint of the court system of our country. And remember, many of these appointments are for life. And he's appointing a lot of fairly young-ish people, everybody's young to me, but young people. And so the impact could be profound for a second administration. Hi.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Aldana, and I'm the director of Westminster Program in American Studies.
Yes.
And I was just hoping you could talk a bit more about your response to Trump's speech this morning and to his approach to the UN in general, given his resistance to the collective.
I didn't hear all of his speech, and so, but it's clear he used the tone. Look, it's about me and me being the U.S. it sounded to me like a campaign speech almost, like setting up for 2020, with the exception of very distinct messages to China and to Iran. But aside from that, it was all about, protecting the unborn, and, I'm going to do, his views of the border and what he can do, and I'm always fighting for Americans, and all of us will always fight for our people first. And he used language that sounded very campaign-esque to me, which isn't a surprise because it was probably written by a lot of people who have, desires for him to be reelected. I do think his strong tone on China, it'll be interesting how they receive that. China, which I don't think he fully appreciates, is about a large part about how they want to save face and not be embarrassed in the process of, relationships and standing, etc. And I think you can get a lot done if you could do it quietly, and that's not his style, to stand up on the world stage at the UN and to take a stick to whack around China the way he did. I don't think that's constructive to reach a larger deal. And the question is, what is, I actually think China, Iran, others have the president boxed in because of the way he approaches things. And so it'll be interesting to see how each party wants to play him right now, knowing he's so focused on his re-election. Hi.
Yeah, so my name's Andrew. Obviously, Canada's really close relationship with the U.S. has been very advantageous in a number of ways, and you mentioned the opportunity there. But I was wondering if you can maybe speak to at what point does that asset sort of become a liability, particularly as with a Trump 2020 possibility, as the U.S. increasingly demonstrates that it has no regard for the rule of law, both internationally and domestically. As someone mentioned, for children being separated from their families in cages. At what point does it actually hurt Canada to be so immensely interconnected with the United States?
I think that's the big question for you as a country, as you watch these behaviors and as they get, more and more exaggerated. I can't tell you at what point that is, and what point do you put your values above, other outcomes. As I said, your values in your pocketbook may go in conflict going forward. And, is it all about jobs? Is it all about selling product? Is it all about that? At the same time, you may find yourself, stepping into a place, a dark place from a value perspective, or are you willing to sacrifice some part of that, threatened relationship to stand up for your core sets of beliefs? And I think that will define the country going forward. If in fact we get a second Trump administration, I think it's a defining time for the country. You're a middle-sized power in terms of economic, military, size, everything. But you've had outsized influence on the world stage promoting this liberal democratic order of things because you've done this in partnership with their neighbor. And we've done this together, and you've had the support of the United States all along the way, even if there are policies that we disagree with. We have generally been in agreement, regardless of Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. We had certain ideals that we promoted, that small L, small d, liberal democratic order of things. If that then is in jeopardy, which it is right now, if it continues along that path, what is the path that Canada wants to take for yourself? And the purpose of this conversation today is to spur those conversations that you have to ask that now. And, you're better to be proactively thinking about the possibility of this happening, as opposed to just getting surprised and being in scramble mode, trying to deal with the fact that it's happening, and circumstances around it then start whirling away every day and coming at you. Your ability to operate strategically may be limited at that point. You're just tactically responding to the U.S. And I think that would be a bad place to be. Look, I'm going to work really hard to make sure this doesn't happen. But I'm also cognizant of the possibility of this happening. Hi.
Which Democrat do you think has the best chance of beating Trump?
Well, according to polls, any person walking the streets could beat Donald Trump, but I'm not sure that that's accurate. It's way in advance, or more than a year away from where we are. Tell me where the economy is. Tell me what actions he's doing. Tell me what he's doing in terms of abusing our relations internationally, what he's doing on what kind of gun violence is taking place domestically at the time, treatment of women and minorities, and where we are. I think there are different candidates based on that environment, actually. I'm all for this process that we're going through. It's painful and long. Different than Canada, which people, you have to just understand. Your parties select who the leader is going to be, and that's what you get. Okay, you pick, whichever party, but your choices aren't. You're not choosing. Your choice is only the Liberal Party, Conservative Party, NDP, Green. This is it. This is your universe. For us, we pick the person who's representing the party. Now, there's something big move afoot in the U.S. that Trump feeling threatened in some way in his primary system. He's basically shutting down the primaries. So the selection process is changed. Maybe it looks a little more like the way you guys have done it here, and the party just picked the leader, and that's the way it is, as opposed to the people. So I will vote for anybody who runs against Donald Trump. That includes if there are any Americans in this room. I will vote for you if you decide to run. I mean, in all seriousness, I think that, we have elected somebody that I don't believe thought he would win. I think found himself in a position. He is being the extreme of himself. I think that it's causing such great damage at so many levels, but I think this damage during 4 years is repairable. 8 years is more permanentized. And so I support, look, I meet with many of these candidates. I go, good luck, keep going. If you're the nominee, I'll be there with you. So. Last question, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow along with what he was talking, because I was going to ask something but more with our country. If this possibility of Trump 2020 taking place, do you feel that our current Prime Minister is prepared for all those possible worst-case scenarios, or
I'll tell you what,
leader
as the former U.S. ambassador, it'd probably be inappropriate for me to dive into your election at this time. I'll let Canadians decide. I just think, look, it's more important that the U.S.-Canada relationship is strong, and whoever occupies 24 Sussex, albeit it isn't occupied right now, but whoever occupies 24 Sussex or the White House, my goal is to promote the U.S.-Canada relationship. The reason I'm taking the position I am so strongly against the president, which I never would have done in a post-ambassadorial role, and I'll tell you my thinking, which we can then bring this together. So 2 things. In the United States, the term ambassador and the title, different than Canada, is for life. So I get this title for life. I think that comes with responsibility, and I owe something back for that. Secondly, when I swore in to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic, when my term was over as ambassador, you don't, swear out. You take an oath. I feel that I am today still under that oath. And I feel some of the things and many things he's doing and saying and the way he's operating is a threat to the Constitution of the United States of America. And thus, I am taking a perhaps significantly bolder step than a former ambassador would ever take, and putting myself way out there in trying to do what I can to A, tell my best friend Canada hey guys, this is bad and it could get a whole lot worse, so I'm here to help the relationship going forward. And back at home, I'm working hard to try to find paths to tackle the damage, fixing the damage he's doing, as well as making sure he doesn't do any more. But with that, thanks for taking time out today.